Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I recently asked my Patreon supporters if they could remember instances in which I had been incorrect about something publicly. Part of the notion here is, I want to encourage everyone to have a humble attitude towards seeking the facts rather than protecting, my truth or your truth or whatever, right? We need to be trying to find things out and not getting attached to our own egos being wrapped around being right all the time. And Graham Shepard, who's been interesting to watch and talk to over the past couple of years too, mentioned to me an accusation of sorts that has been made, I guess, that I leave out parts of Hávamál. And I thought, well, that's not a mistake that I've made because I haven't. But I started thinking, where does that idea come from? So rather than take it as an accusation, I'm going to take it as a good faith question, and I'm going to present four ways that I think someone might think I had left something out of Hávamál and showing you, hopefully convincingly, that I'm not. Okay, so what are the four ways that I think someone might come to think that I had left something out of Hávamál? One is there are lines in at least one paper manuscript, which means, a manuscript from I think it's late 1600s, early 1700s, so 400, 500 years after the manuscript we have, that some early editions have, but the medieval manuscript, the Codex Regius, doesn't. I'm going to show you these. Second is seeing some translation that is so different from mine that you think, oh, Crawford left this out because it's not in his translation, when in fact it's something that I'm just translating really, really differently. This is especially possible with really early translations, which are more likely to be public domain and thus findable without spending money on the internet and probably feeding AI answers. Third thing, which I cannot control for or comment very deeply on, but is quite possible, is very, very often on the internet, and I'm sure off the internet, there are people who make up quotes from Hávamál, uh, which still kind of amazes me. It takes probably 45 minutes to read all of Hávamál. You can check and see if a quote is really there, but people still make up quotes from it. And, it's like um, the way people make up quotes to attribute to Einstein or Marilyn Monroe or whatever. People make up quotes to attribute to Hávamál. And often the made up quotes, in my experience, have been more Viking-y sounding than the stuff that's actually in Hávamál, right? Stuff like, uh, about family or shipmates or something like that, which Hávamál really doesn't emphasize either one of those. And then the fourth thing is people thinking that all that I've ever done is the cowboy Hávamál, which never set out to translate all of Hávamál. That's a separate thing from my translation of the whole Hávamál. So let's talk about these possibilities in that order. Number one is someone has seen an edition or translation that has these additional lines from a paper manuscript. And where these additional lines are is early in the middle of the list of things that you're not supposed to trust. So let me show you how this looks, first of all, in my book called The Wanderer's Hávamál. So The Wanderer's Hávamál, let me also state, is created from the Codex Regius manuscript. It is not me taking some text presented, in nice, clean typed letters online. It is not me taking somebody else's edition and just, passing it through, like tons of stuff on Amazon do that, right? A lot of the really rad looking, Wolf and Fire covers of the Poetic Edda or Hávamál on Amazon are either public domain things or they're barely disguised ripoffs of, sometimes me. Um, That's not what I'm doing there. What I'm doing with the Wanderer's Hávamál is I'm looking at the manuscript, the medieval manuscript, because there is only one medieval Old Norse period manuscript that contains Hávamál, and that is the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda. I looked directly at the manuscript to prepare the Old Norse text that is in the Wanderer's Hávamál, so I did not miss any of the Old Norse text that's there. Now, uh, I did change the the spelling, which everybody does. I made the spelling normalized, right, on the assumption that this text would be something that would be used by people learning Old Norse, and they would know normalized spelling, not manuscript spelling. So, I standardized the spelling to what you can find in a dictionary of Old Norse, especially the ONP, the Ordbog over the Norrøna Prusespråk, at the University of Copenhagen, which is the new standard. Also, kind of by coincidence, I guess, right around the same section where there are some extra lines, I switched the order of two stanzas, but I still show the original numbering. So there's number 88 and number 89. This comes before this in the manuscript, but that's pretty clearly because the scribe just forgot uh, this part before this part, and they're since they can't erase, they're not always good about saying, or there is a mark they can put in that means switch the order of these two stanzas. The scribe didn't do it, but I'm very confident that this is a continuation of this long list that starts in 85 of things you're not supposed to trust, because then you have a new thought in stanza 88. Okay, so in the Codex Regius, which by the way, you can find this for yourself, you can check me, I'm not lying to you. All you have to do is go to, let me show you this, 100.is. So that is manuscript.Iceland, basically, right? These are the digitized collections of the University of Iceland, the Árni Magnússon Institute in Reykjavik. The Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda, the only manuscript that has Hávamál, is GKS 2365 quarto. So here it is. You click right there. And then you can even take a quick link down to each individual poem. So here's where Hávamál starts on page 3R. So you can check this yourself. But anyway, these stanzas in question are on pages 5R and 5V. I have talked about in another video, probably another couple of videos, but one in particular that I'm thinking of about how we number manuscript pages. But here you've got this whole list of things you don't trust, right? Sjúkum kolvi, sjálfróða þræli, volum félagsmæli, volni féldum akri or sonum, right? We just continue the word from the previous page. It's pretty typical. Down here at the bottom, you can see that somebody at some point, this looks like, I mean, notice the main body of ink, this darker ink. Notice the hand. That's a late 1200s Icelandic hand. That's Carolingian insular minuscule. Notice this fainter, different color ink at the bottom there. That is 1600s or 1700s handwriting. Uh, anyway, circa 1700 handwriting. I used to know what it said. It looks like somebody's name, and I can't quite make out what the rest of that is, but that's not text of the poem, right? That's somebody 400 years later. And there's a lot of stuff written into this manuscript 400 years later or so before scholars got more picky about what they would do to medieval manuscripts. You can see there's these line numbers that are inserted on the in the margins there. That's not medieval. But okay, so all that I've done in the Wanderer's Hávamál is I've taken these stanzas and I have normalized the spellings that you can find words in an Old Norse manuscript, and then I have offered my translation, which is not God's gift to Old Norse translation, right? People are going to remember Hávamál a lot longer than they're going to remember me. They're going to be reading Hávamál a lot longer than anybody's going to be reading my translation. This isn't about me owning Hávamál or whatever, right? It's about me trying to transmit the information that I have as well as I can, and you take it or leave it. But we do have this other manuscript, and one thing to keep in mind is the difference between a major difference between 19th century scholars and 21st century scholars is often 19th century scholars, it was actually easier for them to get access to those later paper manuscripts. And so they would often base editions on them. They also, I think, tended to feel like they needed to be completists, and anything extra that was in a later manuscript, they tended to think like, oh, well, that got left out of the earlier manuscript. Whereas I think 21st century scholars tend to favor the oldest version of a text, all of the things being equal, um, and are much more alive to the fact that people do modify texts as they transmit them, and that something that's in a later version of a text that's not in an earlier one may be just added by a later transmitter or even the person writing it down. It's interesting to me that people don't necessarily think about this today when they're lobbying accusations at me about leaving stuff out of Hávamál, because I feel like the same kind of people that might make that kind of accusation tend to be the kind of people that would make accusations about like Christian influence ruining a text. Well, who's the most possibly Christian person who could be influencing a text than these weirdos in the 1600s and 1700s writing this stuff down on paper, who grew up Protestant, right? They're even more like fired up, anti-pagan than their apparently somewhat chiller Catholic predecessors. Um, like, why wouldn't you want to strip out the stuff that was added in later manuscripts if you're worried about that kind of influence? Let me show you this manuscript. This actually took me a long time to track down, and a really long time to find it in this manuscript. But this is apparently the source of these extra lines. National Library Sweden, an Icelandic paper manuscript, folio number 34. This is from 1684. So the person who copied this really transparently, by the way, copied it from the Codex Regius. The spellings and such are and abbreviations and things like that. Pretty transparently, this is copied from the manuscript I just showed you, the only known manuscript from the Middle Ages. And um, okay, let's see what it adds. So down here, stanza 87 down to 88. By the way, notice that these numbers are, I think, consistent with what you're going to see in um, they're almost consistent. They're like one number off from what you're going to see in the Wanderer's Hávamál. Scholars for a long time, even though those stanza numbers uh, aren't numbered in the manuscript, scholars for a long time have been pretty much in agreement about where those stanzas are. One person who was not, you should know if you're into accusing people of distorting facts online, is Guðbrandur Vigfússon, who also put together the massive Icelandic English dictionary. He thought Hávamál had been transmitted out of order, and so he completely scrambles the order. It like he starts with like stanza 111 or something, and it's has no relationship to the order that's in the manuscript. So if you ever think that somebody is messing up the order and all that you've ever seen is Guðbrandur Vigfússon's text, which of course is public domain, so it's easy to find and probably teaches AIs, he he was a nutcase, right? Even his dictionary is the dictionary of a nutcase. So don't take Guðbrandur Vigfússon's word for what stanzas are in what order. Again, you can just look at the manuscript on 100.ts. Okay, but where does this paper manuscript from 1684, where does it add something? So we've got, all right, again, the list of things not to trust. So we're not going to trust a sick calf, a self-ruling slave, a vulva who speaks well, new felled, recently felled, killed dead men on the battlefield, um, an early sown field, and then here's the new stuff, the stuff that's not in the Codex Regius. Oathmalamani, so a man of like frenzied speech, a man who's inclined to speak frenziedly. Wow, this is almost like a warning against uh, certain people on the internet, maybe. Uh, Hunda Gelti, so a hound's barking. I know that Sufus Buga transmitted this although he doubted, by the way, that this was old himself, but he transmitted this as Hunda Helti, a limp, like a limping of a dog. He compared it to some German saying about limping dogs and lying women, which actually sounds like a country song. And it was such weird words for all this stuff that I had to look it up because my German is not as strong as my Old Norse. Anyway, and then the sorrow of a skekju. This is a actually fairly late Icelandic word for concubine, let's say, just to use a word that's not too red in the face. And then a bright sky and a laughing Lord. This word is also late. You wouldn't see this in a 900s text like Hávamál otherwise is. An animal in starvation may no man trust, nor his son too soon. Okay, and now we're back to the stuff that's in the Codex Regius. We've got these three extra lines. That I think is the best case you could make for me having left something out of Hallowall. And again, I've left it out for a real reason. The text that I give you in the Wanderer's Hallowall, or that I transmit also in the second edition of the Poetic Edda, is my edition of the medieval text of Hallowall, right? I don't think that this person from the 1600s is adding that stuff, which Sufis Bugge, even in the 1860s, one of the first responsible scholars to deal with the Eddic material, points out this actually looks a lot like later Icelandic, Danish, German saying. So somebody's just folding that in, right? Very natural way for text to change over time. Someone's just saying, oh, I bet this sort of belongs there. But it's betrayed in the fact that it's later by two words, the skukja for like concubine, herra for lord, that you wouldn't see in a 900s text. By the way, that's another thing that's interesting to me about the sort of accusation there is I really have become quite persuaded from the research into the age of the poems that I've done independently, that Christopher Sapp at Indiana's done, that Leif Olson at the University of Bergen's done, that Hávamál really is a pre-Christian poem, other than probably the Lodfalt in a small part. Um, I'm, you know, interested in presenting this as what it is, something that I think does date to a pre-Christian time. I don't want to distort anything. I don't want to take anything away from that. Um, and by the way, I worked uh, such a consistent manner about this, in such a conservative, consistent manner in editing that text in the Wanderer's Hávamál that, I mean, look at the back of it. There's nice remarks from Ármann Jakobsson at Iceland, Nikisa Sigurðsson at the Abney Magson Institute, who pulled out that manuscript for me, Joseph Harris at Harvard, right? I mean, these are people, these are scholars who are not going to praise this book if I'm outside of the mainstream or leaving something significant out or saying something crazy, right? Um, Not trying to brag or humble brag or whatever, but I mean, you just don't give that endorsement, and it's my most academically endorsed book if I'm doing something irresponsible or weird or dumb with it, right? Okay, so that's the maybe most academically defensible thing you could argue that I left out. Let me come back in a moment after a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost, and I'll talk about reasons 2, 3, 4 that you might accuse me of
Hey
this.
folks, we'll be back to your regular presentation in a moment, but right now I'm here at Grimfrost World Headquarters Longhouse with Johan Hegg, and I just want to remind you that if you have Viking needs, you have a Viking supplier. Grimfrost really cares about getting things right, and if you need replica, well, anything, right? Shields, helmets, weapons, board games, cool t-shirts, hats, all sorts of accessories like that. You can get them at grimfrost.com together with my books, and they ship just about anywhere in the world. So check them out. It does help support the channel.
So reason 2 that I said that somebody might accuse me of leaving something out of Hávamál is they might have seen a translation that's so different that they think that there's something there that somebody else translated that I left out. One specific place that I've had this accusation come at me is okay, there's three public domain translations, right? Two public domain translations, one that I don't think is public domain but comes up a lot online. So the two public domain translations that come up all the time online are Olive Bray's, I think it's from 1910-ish, and Bellows, which is 1930-ish. Both of them are in very old-fashioned English and are sometimes trying to imitate the meter of the original in such a way that you lose the meaning of the original. I've often pointed out that I'm very interested in Old Norse meter, but I think that the purpose of translation is for you to see what was written, to follow the story, follow the content, rather than for me to imitate Old Norse poetry in English. There's differences of opinion about that, whatever. It's a difference of opinion. Um, but these translators often had a very different opinion about that and are trying to uh, sound poetically a little bit more like the original. I don't think very successfully in some respects. Another translation like that that often comes up is sort of hallowed, I feel like in online circles, is Hollanders. It's from like the 1960s, which is like the ultimate example of someone trying to follow the meter and often distorting the content to the jam the English into the same meter as the original. Um, the public domain translations, it's such a strange thing, are more influential than translations by living scholars because they're public domain, right? It's free. You don't have to buy or steal anything to look at it. You can just look at it anywhere online. And they're reprinted thousands of places. And there are 500 people who will sell you one for $1 on Kindle that has a Kindle cover for whatever that's worth. It's got fire and wolves and ravens and stuff, right? Um, but I think that if you compare my translation to the translation of a living scholar, excellent examples, Carolyn Larrington, wonderful scholar, good friend, you will see that while there are going to be particulars that we translate differently, there's not going to be differences in the content, right? You can compare, stanza X in Carolyn's translation to stanza X in my translation and say, this is a translation of the same thing, right? It can be a little bit harder to do that with Bray or Bellows because their translations are sometimes so different from the content, and sometimes also probably I wouldn't be surprised if they do weird things with stanza numbering sometimes. But a particular place that this accusation's come up is with Olive Bray, who translates this word that comes up in Hávamál a lot, manvit, so man, wit, human intelligence, which the poet of Hávamál uses to say intelligence while alliterating with an M, right? So manvit meri, there we alliterate, more intelligence. Bray will translate that word as mother wit. And so I've been accused of leaving out this mother that actually isn't there, right? There's no such word as mother wit in Old Norse. I guess I'll double check myself on that. But that is some, English phrase that I guess people don't really use anymore. But that to Olive Bray is, I guess, a contemporary or understandable reference. So Olive Bray is inserting that. I'm not leaving out a mom. If there was a mom there, I would put it there, right? I'm not trying to distort anything. I want you to see what the text is meant to be read as. You could argue that maybe I should say manwit rather than intelligence, which is how I'm inclined to translate that. I'm inclined to translate it as what you would just say in English. But that's a difference of opinion rather than of me leaving something out. And I certainly didn't leave out some mother that Olive Bray is willing to translate there. Again, if you don't trust me about what the text says, look at it yourself, right? I showed you how to find the very manuscript itself, and I've got a video that will help you read manuscripts, and it's not going to trick you into reading it my way or whatever, right? There's pretty broad agreement about the way to read these things. Third thing that I thought of that someone might think in accusing me of leaving something out of Alvamal is just the made up quotations. And again, I can't anticipate, right? There's going to be five new ones by the end of the day. People do this all the time. They come up with what sounds good and they have a source that sounds good to them, right? Like, oh, I want to use the Viking Code of Ethics as the basis of my philosophy. So they attribute quotes to Hofmall and are just never going to read it. Or maybe they, really do know that it's not there and they just don't care. um, or some AI generates this fake quote or whatever. There's lots of fake quotes that float out there. Again, it takes 45 minutes to read Hávamál in whatever translation you prefer. You'll see that there's not really very much. There's maybe one stanza that I think, sort of violent Viking lifestyle, like you should get up early to kill somebody. Okay, that's, I guess, kind of Viking lifestyle. There's not much about family, except from a very selfish perspective. You should have a son so that it'll make a memorial to you. Just double check whatever translation you like by a responsible party. Again, use Carolyn's if you don't like mine. That's fine. You'll see that this text is something quite different than Viking influencers often portray it as. And then the fourth reason that I thought people might think I was leaving something out of Hávamál is they might think that the Cowboy Hávamál is the only Hávamál translation that I've ever done. Sort of understandable. The Cowboy Hávamál had a real moment online when I first posted it on my old blog around 2012. It's been included in every translation of the Poetic Edda published by Hackett, including the second edition released last year, and it's in an appendix to the Wanderer's Hávamál too. But the Cowboy Hávamál was always intended to be just Gestaþáttur, just the first constituent poem of Hávamál. So roughly stanzas, it's like 1 to 70. I think it's 1 to 81, but I leave out 80. And so I leave out 80 because it says what you ask of the runes will prove true, and my grandfather wouldn't say that. The whole point of the Cowboy Hávamál is that the stanzas about just sort of daily life and not trusting people and it's better to be alive than dead and don't be too smart but don't be too stupid. Don't talk too much but don't not talk. All of that sounded to me so much like my grandfather, right? That practical everyday advice. Then you get into stories about Odin trying to seduce women. You get into the story of Odin sacrificing himself to himself. You get into the bragging wizard part at the end where he talks about the 18 spells he knows. I can't imagine my grandfather saying that. So that was never intended to be part of the Cowboy Hávamál. The Cowboy Hávamál is intentionally just Gestaþáttur, which probably is originally a different poem than the rest. All right, we're probably looking at 5 poems that have been strung together as Hávamál. Um, that's not me being incomplete. I never pretended that the Cowboy Hávamál was all of the 164 stanzas of Hávamál. And but I can understand that people that don't follow my work or know who I am, maybe they've heard of the Cowboy Hávamál and they've read it and said, "Oh my gosh, this isn't complete." But again, why would I have translated? I sacrificed myself to myself into my grandfather's voice. He was dead by the time my grandfather was dead by the time I translated Cowboy Hávamál. Uh, my grandfather died without ever knowing what a Hávamál was. Um, right? I wouldn't talk to him about this stuff. Like he judged me pretty hard about my career choice, and I love him. A lot of that great practical advice that he gave me uh, resonates in mutated form in the Cowboy Hávamál, and I think you can see how a hard-nosed uh, man of long, difficult life with long, difficult experiences might look askance at the choice of a grandson to be a specialist in an ancient language, right? Nonetheless, that made him perfect to be the voice of Hávamál there. But so as much as I sort of wrestled with his memory in a sense to make him Odin's voice in giving practical advice, like, how could I possibly have wrestled that person into the voice of, again, the bragging wizard of the last 18 stanzas of Hávamál, if you see what I mean? It wouldn't make sense, right? I can imagine my grandfather saying, "Don't eat like you're a cow." But I can't imagine him saying, "I know a spell to put out fires," right? How do I put that in his voice? I can't because he would never possibly say it, right? The man would never, never saw a fantasy or a sci-fi or read a fantasy or a sci-fi or cared for myth or anything of the kind, which is fine. But that's why that is incomplete. It wasn't intended to be uh, complete in the sense of my full translation that's in the Wanderer's Hávamál and in the second edition of the Poetic Edda. By the way, if you're familiar with my writings, you'll know that the Wanderer's Hávamál made some changes that aren't in the first edition of the Poetic Edda. But In the second edition of the Poetic Edda, it is the same English text of Hávamál that's in the Wanderer's Hávamál, so the improved translation from 2019 when I went through the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb and read everything that I could from the last couple hundred years that people wrote about Hávamál. Um, I think if there are two things that might be changed in the second edition of the Poetic Edda, it might be that I made sure that in the second edition of the Poetic Edda, everywhere that the word Asir, or its singular os, for that specific family of gods is used, that I'm translating it as Asir and not just as gods, well, because I want you to see the difference between, God, Regen, words for just God, and words for Asir in the second edition translation. So if there were any instances where I was inconsistent about that in Hávamál, that would have been fixed for the second edition of the Poetic Edda, but not yet for printings of the Wanderer's Hávamál. And I feel like there might be a second thing like that, a consistent, yeah, exactly. I no longer say giant, where the Old Norse text is Jotun or Thors. I say Jotun. So any occurrence of Jotun and Hávamál in the second edition of the Poetic Edda would be cleaned up to say Jotun rather than giant. Other than that, I was perfectly happy with the Wanderer's Hávamál translation, and so that's what's in the second edition of the Poetic Edda. And by the way, the other translations in the second edition of the Poetic Edda are massively cleaned up and made more consistent, and influenced by, another 10 years of reading and study. So they're brought up to the same high standard that I set for myself with the Wanderer's Hávamál. If you are interested in reading Hávamál in its entirety with me, looking at the original Old Norse text, even if you don't know Old Norse, you can read a translation and still follow along just fine. Remember that I am doing a Zoom class in which I'll be doing that detailed reading of Völuspá and Hávamál in their entirety in April and May 2026. So check out the link to that. I'll put it in a pinned comment. And I hope that's been of some use to you. And as a final note, um, I have this video from a long time ago. I think it's from 2019, where I read the entirety of Hávamál and translated it stanza by stanza. And I put that up, and I also put up the translations in runes. And I know those runes have been knocked off by people selling stuff online, but I guess it's still whatever. I can't take the cat out of the bag now, and at least it's there to sort of show that it was me who did it. But at any rate, the reason that my published books don't have the entirety of the text of Völuspá or Hávamál or whatever in runes is that it's not how they're transmitted, right? It's maybe fun. I don't usually think of the sort of thing as fun, but like it's maybe fun to sort of try to figure out how someone in the Viking Age would have written one of these stanzas in younger Frühlich runes. But it's just an exercise, right? There's no historical value to it because it wasn't done, right? I don't think that we've lost the runic text of these poems. I think nobody wrote them down at that time. There's no evidence that they were writing down long texts like that. So that's why there's not runes. But in the second edition of the Poetic Edda, there's a few decorative uh, stanzas that I've done in runes just to brighten up the pages. There's a lot of cool artistic touches like that, although most of them are by Liz Wilson. That's just the runes in the map being done by me. Anyway, thanks to those considering taking the classes. They help pay the bills, and they're always interesting for me to really in-depth look at those poems and really take your in-depth questions. And every time that I've done one of these, it's shaped my understanding of these works for the better. Thanks to everybody given to the channel on Patreon. You make the world go around. And thanks to those checking out the second edition of the Poetic Edda or the Wanderer's Hávamál with its Old Norse and English text, and of course, its deliberately somewhat incomplete Cowboy Hávamál. And from beautiful Colorado, which hat? I'm wishing you all the best.